And today, I have the pleasure to present Jennie Erin Smith, who is a graduate of Columbia University and writes on medicine, biology, wildlife, natural history, and Latin America. She also contributes several pieces a year to the New York Times Science section and writes regularly for several medical journals, primarily summarizing research in oncology and neurology. She also writes a semi-monthly column on regulatory affairs in Latin America for the Regulatory Affairs Professionals Society. Jennie has also written in the past for the Wall Street Journal, the Times Literary Supplement, the New Yorker, and others. She is currently senior biomedicine reporter for Science magazine, and her book, Stolen World, was selected among the best books of the year by the New Yorker and the Washington Post. And with that, I present Jennie Erin Smith.
Jennie, for people who don't hear headset, or just speak
I
up.
think it would be easier to have that.
So,
Yeah, all right.
thank you.
Show me how.
So, just like, and then this one.
That sound okay?
Yeah. Can everyone online hear Jennie okay? Hold a little mic close, a little closer to your mouth. And now bear with me while I start the slideshow. I'm sorry, I'm slow.
What? I think I need. Wait. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so yeah, even as the slides are coming up, I'll just introduce myself.
Switch on.
It says it's on.
You got it, sorry.
I will speak up and try not to offend the folks online yelling into the microphone, but okay, sounds good. Okay, so anyway, just to introduce myself, I was born and raised in Albany. Yeah, I went to Albany High School, and as Fred just told you, I'm a science reporter for a bunch of different publications, most recently Science, where I'm covering neurology, neurodegenerative disease, and neuroscience more in general. And I've lived in a lot of different places to do my work, including in recent years, Latin America. So this book, this latest book of mine, which if you subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, yesterday was made the top 10 books of 2025 in the Wall Street Journal, which only 10 they picked. And somehow it's in the top 10. It was in the top 10. And it was on the New York Public Library's year-end list. And so it's gotten a few nice little honors. It was very nicely received critically. And it's the product of, as I say here, a 7-year reporting and writing effort in Medellin, Colombia, where I moved specifically to do this work. I got the idea for this story in the most prosaic way. I was watching TV. I was watching 60 Minutes in 2016. And there was a story called the Alzheimer's Laboratory. Now, I don't know if anybody remembers this. I mean, it's already 10 years old, but it was about a large and enormous extended family in Medellin, Colombia, who were being treated by this charismatic Colombian neurologist, and they were being funneled into a clinical trial to see if Alzheimer's disease could be prevented. All of the people in this family either have or are at risk for a genetic mutation that causes Alzheimer's by about age 45. So this is early onset Alzheimer's disease. And families like this have been known to science at least since the 70s, maybe even I think actually since the 60s. But they were small. This family had turned out to have 6,000 members. So the second largest family was a family in Italy, discovered to have this type of genetic mutation, and they had 200 members. So we're talking on an order of magnitude larger, which of course makes them more interesting to science, because you could recruit people into clinical trials of anti-Alzheimer's drugs to see if it could be prevented. You can study the natural history of the disease, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly what Dr. Francisco Lopera had been doing for 30 years before sort of I came into the picture to talk to him. So let's get the next slide here and introduce Dr. Lopera. So this is Dr. Francisco Lopera. He's extremely famous in Colombia, and until his death, really in the years right before his death in 2024, he had become fairly well known in Alzheimer's research in the United States as well. So he was a neurologist, and his entire career was built on his work with this family that gets early onset Alzheimer's disease. Can we turn the slide? So this is like a little video of Lopera that I like at his home in Medellin, throwing grain to his, throwing bird seed to his birds. And that's just sort of the personality he had. He had this really joyous, wonderful personality. At the time I knew him, as I said, he was already pretty well known, very comfortable, because he had been working with drug companies on trials. But when this story begins, he was an extremely scrappy young neurologist working in a really, really tough environment that I'll tell you about. Can we switch the slide? So this here is a public hospital in Medellin, Colombia, called the San Vicente Hospital. This is a current picture of the hospital. It was built I think it was built about a century ago. Dr. Lopera was a young neurology resident at this hospital when the first patient in this enormous family came to be known to him. He was a 49-year-old man, a farmer with really severe dementia. And he had come in, his family had brought him in from a town many hours away and not accessible by car. Can you switch the slide? So this is sort of an aside, but it's important. Dr. Lopera was a disciple of a man, a really pioneering public health scientist in or public health advocate in Colombia, a physician named Hector Abad Gomez. Hector Abad wanted young physicians in Colombia, and these types of programs eventually extended all over Latin America. He didn't want them graduating medical school not knowing anything about real life. He wanted to send them out all into the countryside for at least a year before they got their medical degrees, to places that were extremely remote and underserved. And the idea was kind of to have this sort of medical community understand what the real public health needs were in this country. So Hector Abad, this was controversial. Hector Abad was considered a leftist communist by many in the medical world, also by the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera. But he had enormous influence on Dr. Lopera. So when Dr. Lopera sees a 49-year-old man with Alzheimer's disease in 1984, he did something that I would consider unusual, but very in keeping with that philosophy. He was not content to diagnose him, write it up, dismiss him. He was concerned about what he was seeing, and he went to the family's farm to observe how they lived. Can we switch the slide? This is the actual original farmstead of the index patient. I visited it in 2021 and got to know that family. The man's name was Pedro Pugarin, and his farm was extremely cut off. You could not get there by car. You had to be on a horse, on a mule. It was 4 hours from Medellin. And Lopera sat down with the family and sketched out their genealogy. Can we switch the slide? And you can see he was really bad at sketching genealogy, sketching family trees, but you can see this enormous number of children in the family. And that was pretty typical of these large Catholic Colombian families who were affected with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And he was able to sketch out enough of a pattern that he could tell immediately that this had a hereditary pattern. And they were telling him stories about other people in the family who had died with the disease and other people in their village who had died with the disease. Can we switch this slide? This is a photo from when I visited the farm in 2021. This is a woman being transported by men holding her tied to a pole transporting a sick person, being transported to a farm where she could be taken in an ambulance to the hospital. So even in 2021, these are or were extremely isolated areas of Colombia where people lived very in keeping with their traditional way of life, which is kind of part of the reason this disease, which probably goes back hundreds of years in Colombia and affects so many people, wasn't discovered until the 1980s. It was just existing in pockets of rural areas in large families. Can we switch the... So Lopera and his colleagues wrote a paper on this family in 1987, kind of throwing in everything they knew about the family and about that original case. And really, all of this almost died here because the same year, Hector Abad was murdered. And they're started by right-wing paramilitaries who were linked to drug cartels. And a spate of murders occurred at the university that were actually targeting physicians. Some of these physicians were active in left-wing politics. Some of them had nothing to do with any politics. But it became such a dangerous moment in Colombia. And just the 1980s in Colombia were just like a cauldron of violence. And so this could very well have been the last paper because Dr. Lopera ended up going into exile in Europe. And he remained there for a few years. Can we change the slide? So yeah, this is Hector Abad, and these are some other physicians, and that was sort of protest memorial that occurred after that. But that's how awful the situation was in Colombia at that time. We keep going. Right. So when Dr. Lopera returned to Medellin a few years later, things had actually gotten even worse. Pablo Escobar was, waging war effectively against the Colombian government. And this actually had an interesting effect on the ongoing study with Alzheimer's disease because, can we switch the slide? Can you switch it one more and then I'll switch it back there? What happened was the countryside was getting so violent that people were coming into the city. People were coming into Medellin and they were coming into the neurology clinic where Dr. Lopera was working again. So all of a sudden, more people with early onset Alzheimer's were starting to make themselves known to the physicians. And then they were starting to get an idea of the true magnitude of this family. Can we go back? And another fortuitous development occurred, which is that an American physician named Ken Kosick, who's actually a very well-known Alzheimer's researcher in California, he was at Harvard at the time, happened to show up in Colombia. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it occurs in Alzheimer's disease and it causes enormous brain damage. So actually, Ken was the first person to describe tau. He also had been working with early onset Alzheimer's families. And in Colombia, he met Dr. Lopera, and it was just one of those fortuitous scientific and personal relationships that would go on to bear fruit till the end of Dr. Lopera's life. They were close collaborators and close personal friends. Here up here, you can see his diary. It was funny, a lot of this No, I'm gonna stop there, but I'm not gonna talk about this slide. There came a time, Dr. Lopera and Dr. Kosick successfully described the gene and the genetic mutation that was causing early onset Alzheimer's in these families. They launched a gene hunt in Colombia in the 1990s. They published the results in Nature. But what was happening is that the violence just was not ceasing. So in the early 2000s, this study basically went dormant. Lopera's researchers were getting kidnapped in the country in the countryside when they were off looking for families. Lopera himself was kidnapped. Just too many bad things were happening, so they could not continue their field research. So once again, as in 1987, this study nearly ended here. 10 years later, so now we're at, well, let's go one back. 10 years later, around 2009, one back, yeah. Yep. Yeah. So this represented the beginning of the era that we're in now, where immunology drugs were being considered to for use in Alzheimer's disease to attack the amyloid and tau proteins in people's brains. And it was thought that it might be worth trying to give these drugs to people who were definitely going to get sick because they had genetic mutations that would guarantee that they became sick by a certain age before they became sick, to see if their illness could be prevented. So this was the beginning of an idea that resulted in essentially a landmark clinical trial in Colombia, which I was there to follow. Dr. Kosik and Dr. Lopera really believed that the Colombians would make an ideal population for this trial. But this was a really complicated situation. These were poor people. These were rural people. And for all the time that Dr. Lopera had been studying them, he and his investigators collected their genetic information. He knew who was a mutation carrier and who was not a mutation carrier, but these people were not necessarily told. Well, in fact, they weren't told at all. The rule was not to tell them. So when you're designing a clinical trial like this of a drug that you might be trying it for years, Alzheimer's trials are very long. It was a lot to ask of people to join this trial, to take an experimental agent that it wasn't even clear whether it was going to be safe for years on end, with a whole ton of restrictions to your lifestyle. People couldn't get pregnant. They couldn't smoke pot. I mean, there were all kinds of restrictions on people. But it's really testament to the families that they and their desire to sort of contribute something to the global Alzheimer's problem, that they were willing to go for it and to participate in this trial. So let's switch slides. Yeah, the New York Times wrote about this effort in 2010. Here, I think on this side, you have an editorial in The Lancet. It was considered a landmark and important trial, in what's often called a vulnerable population. Here you see some of the original family trees. This was in the Times that Dr. Lopera and his colleagues had constructed. And again, the drug company that was making the study drug gave them money to go back out into the countryside, including in very dangerous conditions, and really try and find the true extent of the family. And that's when they learned that they were actually 6,000 people. So my job, as I came into this in 2016, 2017, was to get to know some of those family members. I obviously wasn't going to get to know all 6,000 of them. I probably got to know, in the end, about 20 of them. My objective was to write a book that both reflected the research effort, the full story of the research effort, but also got to know what it was like to be a member of these families and to live with this disease. Can we switch this? So these girls here are sisters in their 20s and 30s. They're from the family that became the principal family of my book. They are wonderful friends and were wonderful informants to me. And in the middle here, in this lower corner, is them with their mom. So in the book, I refer to Daniela is the girl on the left. Her name is Flaca, and they're super important protagonists of mine. And their mom, Duralba, died of Alzheimer's disease in 2018 at the age of 49. How I got to know these girls is really something. Dr. Lopera and his team conducted brain autopsies, they still do, of people who died with early onset Alzheimer's, to maintain a really comprehensive brain bank that's kind of unique, because they have these long, full clinical histories of all these cases. Now I would say they have hundreds of brains. I think at the time this was like their 300th brain. So I attended the autopsy of a woman, I knew nothing about her, who died at 49. And a few weeks later, her daughters came to the clinic to pick up those autopsy results, because it's something that they did with people. They shared the results of the parents' autopsy. And the girl in the yellow shirt was really weirdly outspoken with the researchers and very angry that she wasn't being told whether she herself was a carrier of this mutation. So I thought, well, that's interesting. They usually when people in these families talk to the media, they all had only good things to say about the researchers, and only good things to say about the program. But in this case, I was seeing some sort of conflict, you know, and I'll explain. Let's continue with that. So again, this is the same family, the Lopez Pineda family. And in this family, the generation above the girls, their mother and her siblings, there were 10 siblings in that generation, and 7 had early onset Alzheimer's disease. So and when I say had early onset Alzheimer's, they died by 50. Because of the way families are structured in Colombia, and at least the way these families were structured, there it was the rare instance in which the spouse was the caretaker. More often, it was the young adult son or daughter who was the caretaker. So this was a large group of cousins and sisters and cousins who all had to care for a parent for many, many years. That completely derailed their lives. And I write a lot about that because when I came into this story, I was 44 years old, and I thought the most moving aspect of it to me would be that to watch people my own age getting sick with this. But actually, I ended up really feeling for the younger generation. And there were a couple reasons for that. One is because, as I said before, this was a rural group of people who became an urban group of people. They were country people who gradually over generations moved into the city. So these girls had much more education than their parents. And so to be taking care of a sick person, it's not the same to be doing it in a farmhouse as it is to be doing it when you're supposed to be in college. And that's exactly what happened to them. You were talking about medically assisted dying before. This gentleman here was their uncle, whose name is John Freddy. I mean, he's sick in this picture. He's peeled off all the leather of the couch, and he's down to like one or two vocabulary words here. He's not. I think he's only about 47 in that picture. He eventually passed away as well. He actually did receive a sort of medically assisted dying. He was one of the few people in this cohort that I experienced that with. And it was interesting because it was in a different culture. It's a very Catholic culture, but physicians made that possible for him. Um, let's continue with the slides if you can. This is their mom. This is the girl's mom, Doralba. What I would do is I would ask Dr. Lopera if he could provide me with a clinical history of some of these folks. And because she had passed away, he gave me her full series of clinical reports. He was following these people from a healthy state into illness. This was a long-standing natural history study that he was conducting. And it's interesting. You can see here it says she's asymptomatico. She's 33 years old. She has no memory complaints. But here it says she sees a little owl coming toward her. She doesn't know if she's dreaming it or if she's seeing it. So that was at age 33. So probably she was already to some degree symptomatic at that point. And her daughters were really amazed when I told them that story. It's kind of something that a lot of people, when you have a person with Alzheimer's in your life, you realize that even before the symptomatic period, there were things happening that you later understand. And so I thought that was really something. Can we continue? This is me with a lot of different members of the family. I attended their weddings. This is the daughter of the original patient up on her farm. This is, and you'll see a lot of people, they're all women. And that's because I really had more access to women than to other people. Women were my best informants. They let me closest into their lives. But the way I reported this book was really a lot of hanging out and getting to know people. And I like to say that if you show up to report a story and you have a microphone in hand and you have a week, you ask people how they feel about their disease, what's their experience been, and they will give you an answer. That's kind of like in science, that's called like a cross-sectional study or a cross-sectional view of something. It's a fixed point in time. But what I think I got in this book, and I hope you will read it, was a sort of longitudinal view over a 7-year period of how people were living with this disease. They didn't necessarily feel the same way about it at all times. People would say, for example, I want to know if I carry the genetic mutation. I'm really annoyed at Dr. Lopera for not giving me this information. I'm going to go out and get a test. And then when they made the appointment for the test, they canceled the test. Or, or somebody who didn't want to talk about the disease and didn't want to even think about getting it, but with her husband was like furiously saving for a house, almost like in the event their luck went against them. They wanted to have their family set. So it changed people's behavior and it changed people's outlooks, even when they weren't directly talking about it. Want to keep going? I end the book. Daniela was a wonderful informant for me, and I think it's something I wouldn't have been able to do with the previous generation because they were more farm-born people who didn't have that high literacy level. But she wrote to me all the time. She journaled. She wrote things in her diaries that she then shared with me and that I could use in my book. And this was her last, and I don't even want to tell you what it is because it's it's like the last page of the book, right? But this was her memories of her mother in her last days and what she thought she was experiencing as an Alzheimer's patient and what she thought her mother was trying to express. One thing that's interesting is you don't hear among these people for whom Alzheimer's disease and early onset Alzheimer's disease is something they know very well. They understand the trajectory of this disease. You never hear from them, my mother's gone. There's nothing of her left. She's an empty shell of a person. I think you very rarely hear that in these families because they were so accustomed to accompanying their loved ones through this disease process that I think they recognize their humanity at every step, including the end. So that was very touching to me. Can we flip forward? So then things get sad. So I was there to learn about the families, to learn about the researchers, but also to follow a landmark clinical trial in progress. In 2019, the same drug that they were trying, which is related to the approved drugs now to treat Alzheimer's disease, the infusions, it was failing in trials of people with symptoms in the United States and Europe. And so the families were getting this news that the drug we're taking is failing. So that was kind of a bad omen, and it just sort of cast a shadow over everything that was going on in the research program. Can we continue? And then a really strange thing happened. Just as it looked like Dr. Lopera's entire research program was going to be harnessed to a clinical trial that was bound to fail, they started discovering cases. Again, I said this is a family of 6,000, right? When you have such a large cohort in science, you're going to find all kinds of interesting things and interesting cases that you wouldn't find in a smaller cohort. They started discovering cases of people with the genetic mutation who did not get sick. And that was thought to be impossible. That if you had, it was called a mutation, you call it 100% penetrance. If you have this genetic mutation, you are destined to get dementia within a certain range of ages. And they started finding cases both in their archives of people who had already died and among people who were already living of people who did not. This case, can we proceed forward? Sure. No, I'm cueing you. Don't worry. That's fine. This case here in the center, this was a picture that appeared in an article that I did for the New York Times about this woman when she did finally die of something completely different. She was 78 years old before she became really symptomatic with Alzheimer's disease. She was supposed to get sick at 45. This case made international news. It made the front of the New York Times in an article called "Why Didn't She Get Alzheimer's?" And it was proposed in a paper in Nature, the journal Nature, that she had a separate mutation on top of her bad mutation that was preventing her from developing symptoms. So that galvanized a very interesting, different approach in Alzheimer's disease research to look less at how do we attack disease proteins in the brain and more about what type of natural protections can we mimic. So I don't know if you've heard of the genetic profiles APOE, APOE, APOE 2, 3, and 4. If 4 is, a risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease. She had a copy of a gene on APOE 3 that was considered potentially responsible for this. So there was all kinds of research after this point, all kinds of attention paid to APOE and things that can make APOE either protective, because if you have 2 copies of APOE2, you're quite protected from Alzheimer's, or which can turn it into a risk factor. So again, another major sort of, what it really means, I think is still, the jury's still out on all this, but it was yet another major contribution to Alzheimer's research from Colombia. Can we go one more? I think this is the last one. Yeah. This is a whole other thing. I mean, we all know that the anti-amyloid drugs did get approved in the United States. One shocker to me in the course of all this was the price tag that they put on them, because this is a population whose median income is like $400 a month, right? And when a similar drug to the one they were trying got approved in the United States, the original price tag was $56,000. So I calculated in the book that a Colombian on minimum wage, which is what half of people in Colombia make, is that country's minimum wage, would have had to save 18 years in order to afford 1 year of this drug. And that really surprised me. And also it made me, I write a lot about it in the book, but there were really no provisions made to provide these medications for people in Colombia. That was something that I think was sort of insinuated, that if it worked, they would somehow have a way to get it. But I'm not sure that that provision was ever there. And in the end, we can go into the next slide. In 2022, the drug failed in these families. And of course, it was a result that most of us anticipated, including the researchers, considering that people were getting sick in the trial. Of course, some people were on placebo, but even still, it was an awful lot of people beginning to develop symptoms. So I think that there were murmurs for a very long time that this wasn't working. And then we got the definitive and heartbreaking results that were covered in the New York Times. This was a piece by Pam Bellick, who writes about Alzheimer's for the Times. I have a little tagline at the end of it because I helped with that piece. Lopera had spent 40 years, his entire 40-year career, working with these families and somewhat building up to this moment, like, can we fix this? Is there anything we can do for you? And I know how personally painful it must have been to him and his research associates that in the end this didn't work. But the next slide that's Dr. Lopera dancing with his patients at the end of the clinical trial, when he had just gathered them all in an auditorium and told them that this didn't work. And of course, people cried. I mean, anytime a clinical trial fails, it's really hard on people. But this was a long trial. The expectations were sky high for this trial. This was considered the ideal population in which to test this type of drug, and it didn't work. But after that news was delivered, they stuck around for lunch. They stuck around and danced. The university band played, and Dr. Lopera, I think he danced with every single one of them until, by the afternoon he was about to collapse. At that time, he had a melanoma that he knew he had. And a year, oh, you know what? No, sorry. He didn't know he was sick. A year later, he would find out that he was sick. But at any rate, he didn't live long after this moment, but I thought it was a nice tribute to who he was and his relationship that he built for 40 years with these people and the level of energy that this physician had. So I'm going to leave it here and we can have some questions if you like.
One question.
Mhm.
You step up and take the microphone.
Mhm.
There should be one over here.
Well, thank you very much. I have several questions.
Okay.
First off, from onset of debilitating
Yeah.
symptoms to death, what was the typical length?
8 years.
8 years.
Mhm.
And how did the families support these patients? Did they get any public assistance?
No. So that's a really important question. Can I answer that before your next question? First of all, it's a question that permeates this entire book. They had extreme difficulty supporting these patients. Memory care and nursing homes exist, of course, in Colombia, but generally speaking, this population was a poor population even within Colombia. So really, that's where you had the recruitment of the young people to care for older members of their family. That's how it was traditionally done. A lot of times when people gave talks like, about these families, because they were sort of known, something romantic would be said about like nobody warehouses their parents in Colombia. We take care of them in our homes, but they had no choice. And I saw the impact of that on young people, and it derailed them terribly. Mhm.
Trial.
Yes. 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 So once this population, so the trial itself failed, right? But Lopera, Dr. Lopera, or this research group as a place that could carry out clinical trials, they proved that they could do it. Everyone said they couldn't do it. I mean, you saw the state that Colombia was in, right? Shortly before this trial took place, shortly before recruitment in 2008, 2009. I mean, we were still having, paramilitary offensives in the countryside and guerrilla warfare and kidnappings and stuff like that. So it was thought that it couldn't be done, but they did it. They did it very well. And so, needless to say, now, but of different types of drugs, not necessarily these anti-amyloid antibodies.
No, you were there for what, 20 years?
No, 7. Mhm.
In your own.
Well, my husband, my husband moved with me and I was always a reporter. So I wasn't working on this book every single day. I, the proceeds of my reporting, uh, yeah, I was reporting for Medscape. I was reporting for different other publications. So that sustained me, and the cost of living there's low. So the little bit, the bits I got from the book advance, plus my own journalism allowed me to live pretty well for that time. Sure.
So this is for, this population has early onset, Alzheimer's.
Yep.
Is this thought to be relatively similar to
Yeah.
late onset Alzheimer's, or, are there going to be probably differences that will affect how effective any treatments that work on them?
It's a really good question. It's a little bit of a $1 million question as well that so until you had, more recent technologies like single cell RNA sequencing, stuff like that, it was hard to tell what genetically was going on in the brain with early onset and late onset Alzheimer's, what genes were being turned on and off. What people did know is that the trajectory was similar in terms of the amount of time, right? The symptom trajectory. This is a more aggressive form of Alzheimer's. It's a little bit, but basically it follows the same pattern. And one of the reasons that these brains were so important to study, and the NIH was supporting the brain bank in Colombia, was because with people who are older who get Alzheimer's disease, they have all kinds of other things, other pathology in their brains, vascular and other pathology. So they really wanted to use these brains to help answer that question. What happens if you have a sort of pure Alzheimer's? Well, that's the only thing wrong. So a lot of studies have been done on that, and a lot of sort of sequencing, single cell RNA sequencing to try and elicit this exact thing, because the pharma companies are not doing this for early onset Alzheimer's. They're doing this for late onset Alzheimer's. And the assumption all along is that what works on early onset disease is likely to work on late onset disease. But that's a big assumption. So yeah, it's a very good question and it's still not answered. Hmm.
Alzheimer's versus dementia, is there a difference in that? How is that?
Yeah.
Did that come in the trials or what you saw?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is controversial, but until Alzheimer's disease was defined with biomarkers, which include scans, brain scans of amyloid protein, now blood tests of amyloid and tau, until there were sort of biomarker parameters that could say this person has symptoms of dementia and they also have this biological marker. Um, it was unclear whether everybody in Alzheimer's clinical trials actually had Alzheimer's or other types of dementia, which could be Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia, other types. So this led to a more biomarker centric both criteria for inclusion into the clinical trials, but also for treatment, because Alzheimer's sort of got redefined, right, by biomarkers, and that's extremely controversial because many of these drugs do a great job reducing. In fact, I don't know if you read the results from a couple weeks ago where a common diabetes drug, semaglutide, was tried in Alzheimer's disease because it was found to be potentially preventive of Alzheimer's disease in people with diabetes. So it was tried in people with actual symptoms, early symptoms, and it didn't do anything. But what's interesting is it reduced the biomarkers of amyloid and tau. Everything reduces these biomarkers. But what effect that's having clinically is A, harder to measure, and B, causing no small amount of controversy to say, like, how much is this really helping people? We're not giving people drugs in order to lower biomarkers. You're giving people drugs so that they don't progress, right? So that's a complicated issue. There's a lot of money sort of influencing that issue.
Okay, fine. Also, if anybody, I haven't seen any questions from online. If you have questions, raise your virtual hand and we'll recognize you. And how are you doing how's your voice holding?
Good.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
In the book, you mentioned that one family had, as a toddler, one of the daughters adopted by a local American family.
Yes.
Came back.
Yes.
Did that fact they were now American?
Yes.
American welfare. Did that have any effect on bringing the knowledge or the concern about Alzheimer's into the United States to spark any kind of?
Well, okay, so this is a story. So what Fred's talking about is there was one of the stories that I relate in my book concerns a woman in her late 30s who had been adopted out of Colombia during that dangerous period in the 1980s. She was neglected by her Colombian family and she was adopted by an American family and raised in the United States and had a wonderful life. And when she came back to meet her birth family in Colombia, she realized that they had this disease, right? That her sisters were in the clinical trial and her biological mother was quite ill. And so she then went out and got tested when she came back to the United States and was positive for the mutation. So that was just a devastating blow. She'd already had a really rough childhood before she was adopted. And then she found herself to be a carrier. But she's a quiet person and has a big job. So no, she doesn't talk about it. I changed a lot of details about her life. Mm-hmm. Yes. In this country, in Colombia, yes. So yeah, Lopera, I think, I hope that this book gets across the level of obstacle that the levels of obstacles that these scientists faced. I mean, they were facing threats to life and limb all the time as they did this research, and they also had very little money. So yeah, I mean, Lopera died at the height of his fame. He was widely recognized in Colombia and was increasingly recognized outside of Colombia. I pick at him a little bit in the book for sort of resting on his laurels a little bit and enjoying going to conferences and getting prizes that often included money and these wonderful honors and accolades that seemed to only increase the more embedded he became in Alzheimer's drug research. And he was also a speaker for these companies, and not disclosing that to the patients, which I thought was super important. If you're a speaker for companies, if you're getting paid to represent them, and you're soliciting people to join a clinical trial based on your historic trust with those families, you better disclose that information. But again, all this stuff was like, this development was really only the last 2 or 3 years of his life. Sure.
I like to be kind of shy.
We'll look the other way.
I had a couple of questions. One was, I'm familiar that the anticolon, I can't pronounce that.
Cholinergic inhibitors, yeah.
Both one to getting Alzheimer's.
Oh, you're talking about benzos. You're talking about like, okay, maybe. I think I don't, yeah. I don't know.
You weren't allowed
To smoke pot.
My next question, and you could just speak to it on any level,
Mhm.
is just the knowledge of knowing whether or not you have that genetic marker.
Mhm.
My parents, both in their 90s,
Mhm.
developed dementia,
Mhm.
and it is not necessarily a lovely way to go.
No,
And I think that later onset is better.
sure.
But it is interesting, as far as somebody still being there.
Yeah.
being present. I visit my mother, she's close to 99 now,
Yeah,
and, we don't want to list the things that she can't do,
sure.
because it's a long list. But, I almost akin it to, Winnie the Pooh, when he holds that balloon and keeps from going off, that, sometimes a family member or something familiar can ground that person.
Yep.
And kind of keep them in that modality of who they used to be. And sometimes the light is on and nobody's home, and sometimes
Sometimes there's somebody there. The young people in this book were really amazing because they'd gone through this so many times, not just with their own parents, but with their aunts and uncles. They were so gifted at getting through to people with Alzheimer's disease. And my main protagonist in this book, Daniela, ended up migrating to Spain around 2022, 2023. I think it was 2022 she left for Spain, and actually ended up a caretaker for people with Alzheimer's because she just knows exactly how to get through to them and has that kindness and that loving. I saw incredible generosity of spirit and beyond in families. I also saw incredible selfishness. So there's no way to qualify this like by culture. You can't say Colombians take care of their family members with Alzheimer's. Some completely neglected them. But the ones who took care of people with Alzheimer's really, hey, really, he's a, he's got a, yeah, he's interested. Yeah, they really took care of them well. It was really touching to see. Like they had tricks. They had tricks. They would play a song on their phone, or they would say something, 3 times or, yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
now for drugs that can, I'm wondering how much is driven by the pharmaceutical and how much is going to really make a difference.
Well, the good news is that there's a lot of drug development in Alzheimer's. I don't know that this current crop of anti-amyloid antibodies is that effective, and there's no real way to find out because when the trials were done, they basically approved them on slight clinical effects plus biomarkers because the FDA just kind of, that's their way of doing things right now, or it was with this class of drugs. So now they're not really being systematically studied. It's all anecdotal at this point forward. So some neurologists say they work and that they like using them. I've talked to a lot of neurologists who say they like using them. So it's really hard to say because it's not going to be rigorously studied from this point forward. But what you do have is a very robust pipeline in Alzheimer's disease of all kinds of targets that are not just amyloid protein, which is sort of like the point of entry for Alzheimer's disease. For years, and I would say the Colombians kind of got sucked into this as well. The conceit was that getting rid of amyloid protein in the brain would stop the sequence of, of the progress or the progression of the disease, like all the other things that happen in that cascade of brain damage and inflammation would stop if you could stop it at that point. But that hasn't really been shown. And so I think there's a lot of other targets being investigated, including inflammation targets, things that keep brain immune cells from overreacting to these like triggers. So there's a lot in the pipeline. I have faith that something will work. Yeah. Mhm.
Lisa? Question? Yeah. Oh, come up and take the mic. While we're waiting for Risa to come over here, I want to put another plug in for Jenny's book in case you haven't
You
bought it
must.
yet.
You must.
$5.
It is, and it's available. It's actually pretty cheap right now on Amazon. I think it's like $13 or something. So yeah, I would definitely take advantage of that. Well, I don't know if the Wall Street Journal, maybe that'll jack the price up a little.
Oh, my question,
Uh-huh.
one is, have they ruled out any environmental factors?
Yes.
Because I thought, gee, they're all in this one location.
A lot of people thought that in the beginning. No, it's not that there couldn't be environmental interactions, but it's such a known, the presenilin gene, mutations on the presenilin gene cause early onset Alzheimer's disease. They have a mutation on the presenilin gene. How they got that mutation, the mutation is very old in the population.
Substance there.
Well, there's tons of mining chemicals, farm chemicals and all that, but it would not explain, first of all, it wouldn't explain the fact that it's inherited in an autosomal dominant manner with 50% of offspring getting it, right? But yeah, there could be a lot of interactions there. The mere fact that you have the gene explains 90%, but there's room for other things. Mhm.
And also, just in a general sense, you are so knowledgeable. How did you acquire your knowledge of this kind of situation just by?
In the project. Yeah, I didn't write about neurology before. My last book was about reptile smuggling. Yeah.
Have a background in medicine, but you've learned on.
Well, my father's a doctor. It's all I got. But I became, in around 2009, I started reporting on medicine for an online medical news site. So I did know how to parse clinical trial results. I was sort of familiar with that. Yeah, sure. Thank you. I did.
Semaglutide, or whatever they're called, are actually derivative of
Yes, a Gila monster. Yes, yes. It all comes together.
film trials. What is the current research? I assume this was referring to the trials in
Colombia. Yeah, I mean, there are more trials, including in Colombia. This is a little bit, I haven't been there, but I know from the NIH reporter, because these trials are NIH funded in addition to pharma funded. From NIH reporter, I know that there is another trial of another anti-amyloid drug in younger members of this same Colombian population. The mode of action of this drug is different. I don't have super high hopes for it. And I think they have to be careful with what drugs they're picking, because I think you can, and I've seen what I saw in this, and I talk about it in the book. I expected that when people generationally in Colombia, education levels have increased, at least in the area where I was with generations. So very common for grandma to have no education, mom to have 2 years of education, and son or daughter to have 9 years of education. And my assumption was always that the people with less education would be less likely to want to participate in science. And that was not true at all for this cohort. The people with more education were more skeptical and more demanding of the researchers, which is probably as it should be. you know, the older generation appreciated that Dr. Lopera had taken the trouble to come see them in their villages. And I think he was so charming and nice and rural, and he spoke their language, and he knew, he just was one of them in a lot of ways. He came from a similar area. And so they put their trust in him. But I question whether generations now are going to put as much trust in him. Now, they're probably compensating people in some way, shape, or form. There's all kinds of ethical, you know, guidelines. None of them are really exactly firm about how and whether you can compensate people who are participating in a clinical trial. People were marginally compensated for this long trial. But I wouldn't be surprised if they were offering more for the subsequent trials, because I don't know how else you would get people into them.
For people online.
The follow-up to Lisa's question about possible environmental factors.
Mhm.
I was wondering about why the people in the trial were not permitted to smoke pot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for description of the culture's custom for young people to take care of the sick and the older people.
Mhm.
Does that mean that younger people never had the means or encouragement to find a marriage partner in a different village?
Okay, that's an important question. So in the end, this is not a recessive mutation. This is a dominant mutation. So it wasn't caused. There was a lot of cousin marriage in these villages, and yes, there was a lot of, you know, endogamy in these villages, but that was not the cause of this disease. It kept the disease there because you're continually sort of cross marrying, right? And it kind of it could keep the disease, I don't know, sort of in different pockets. It existed in different pockets all around this region of Colombia. As far as, so it wasn't, yes, it's not good. But no, it wasn't a cause. As far as like other substances that people take, it wasn't that they thought marijuana was so bad or anything. It's just, it's widely used in Colombia. And the question was, you know, could it affect the drug itself? Could it affect the study drug? And they just didn't want anything that would affect the study drug. But I do recount in the book one episode in which Otto comes to this region of Colombia and announces that they're going to do a clinical trial of marijuana in this population. And Lopera, to his credit, shut that down real quick, because I think, you know, obviously cannabis is so widely used, especially in that population, that if it had any effect whatsoever, we would have known it a long time ago. So yeah. So I would think it's neither here nor there. I would think it's neither here nor there. Yeah.
Your personal, what's next on the horizon for you? What projects are you working on now?
Well, I after this book, so what was I doing? I was looking for projects. And then I got a job. So that's my project, is I'm working for Science Magazine now covering neuroscience, and I have a lot to learn because I learned a lot about Alzheimer's disease during this project. I learned a lot about Alzheimer's, about early Alzheimer's, about Alzheimer's genetics, uh, a little bit about Parkinson's, a little bit about other dementias like frontotemporal dementia. But neuroscience is much larger than that. So my job now is to work for this magazine and really expand my coverage, you know, of neuroscience. So I'm writing about different things. Yeah, not just dementia. Learning more all the time. No, as a writer. Mhm. Yeah, but I needed a job. Like no, these projects, these book projects are really draining. They're, I practically do. No, this month I am, but no, I don't live in my parents' basement, but I do find these projects like draining. They're draining financially. They're draining in other ways. And you know, when I finished this one, I was going to start another book, but I just like sort of didn't get on it. And so I think this is the best thing for me right now is to just sort of, have a, paycheck. Yeah. A paycheck addiction.
Any other questions? I do want to thank you, Jenny, very insightful.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.